close your eyes or just use your imagination for a second here. And imagine that you're driving down the road and you come across water. And it looks like it's just like a couple inches standing there in the middle of the road. What's going through your head? Or do you stop? What's going through your head?
Like, is it on the road?
It's on the road. Looks like, I don't know, maybe like 3 inches of water.
I'd probably go through it. I go like straight through it. No fear.
Welcome to another episode of Weather Ready or Not. I'm your host, Dakota Smith. And right now we're in the middle of a conversation I had with a friend of mine from college, Mike. He's a graduate student studying material sciences.
Would there be a point where you wouldn't go through it?
Probably not. I mean, I go through water a lot, actually.
What, so like, say it's just like, it looks like a foot of water.
Well, then I won't go through it. Like what?
How many inches would you have to see to not go through it?
Like, I'm driving my car, right?
Yeah, you're driving your car.
Probably like 6 inches. I'll do 5, but not 6.
Mike said he'd do 5, but not 6. And at the time, this had me cracking up. I was imagining Mike getting out of the car, walking into the flooded road, taking out his ruler and measuring the depth of the water. And like the good scientist that he is, he'd measure it at several points throughout the road. In hindsight, though, this is probably how a lot of people think. It doesn't look that deep. We can do it. Or it's just a few inches of water, and then we're home. And most people might make it through, but every now and then there's water that looks deceivingly shallow and non-threatening. And then bam, you lose control of your car, and chaos could ensue. Because of this risk, the National Weather Service coined a phrase to deter motorists from crossing flooded roadways. I thought I'd ask Mike about it, since he seems pretty uncertain about whether or not to cross a flooded road.
Have you ever heard of the phrase, turn around, don't drown?
Turn around, don't drown. No, I have not.
Turn around, don't drown is a phrase and part of a campaign created by Hector Guerrero 12 years ago. He was a meteorologist at the Weather Service office in Brownsville, Texas at the time. It was developed in response to a majority of flooding fatalities being vehicle-related. The concept behind it is that if there's a chance that a waterway ahead of you is flooded, aka if you see water, then turn around, don't drown. Simple, right? The phrase has recently come under some criticism, and in this episode we'll dive into some of that as we examine Houston area flooding. Today we'll take a look at the late spring and early summer flooding that occurred in Texas earlier this year, and we'll end up chatting with a few people who lived in the area that was impacted. But first, let's get an idea of the meteorological setup that ultimately led to the flooding. And for that, we'll go to Lance Wood, the Science Operation Officer at the Houston-Galveston, Texas Weather Service office.
Sure. Well, we had, two devastating flood events, one in mid-April, April 17th and 18th, and then about 6 weeks later, in late May, May 26th and 27th. In both cases, we had slow-moving, powerful upper-level storm systems approaching from the west, and then also very high moisture levels. In fact, in the April event, I would say it was near record levels for April as far as the moisture available. So that combination of the slow-moving storm system approaching from the west and the very high moisture levels led to, in both cases, dangerous flash flood environments.
Now, Lance mentioned that eastern Texas has seen a few bouts of flooding in the past few months. I'm going to focus on the flooding in late May, but in both of these flooding events, there was essentially a lot of water vapor in the air and a few weather systems that triggered thunderstorms, which ended up having plenty of moisture to work with. Now, flash floods generally occur when one storm moves very slowly and puts down enormous amounts of water, or when several storms move over the same area, again putting down tremendous amounts of water. The latter version is called training because the storms act like a train, each cell or car moving over the same spot, replacing one another. And that's exactly what happened on May 26, 2016. Thunderstorms began to form in the suburbs northwest of Houston and went on for hours and hours, putting down more and more rain in the same area. When it was all said and done, isolated areas received over 20 inches of rain, with a large area receiving over 6 inches of rain. Just think about where the 20-inch mark is on your body. For most people, that would be just about your knee. The thing about water is that it can flow and pile up in low-lying areas, creating pools of water several feet high. That day, there were numerous rescues of people who weren't expecting what was coming their way. The National Weather Service, however, did issue a slew of watches and warnings. So I asked Lance, what was the office like that day?
Yeah, that's a good question because we're generally staffed, for good weather. So when we have, something like this going on, we pretty much almost, double or triple our staff, for those kind of events because we have a lot of extra products to issue, more flash flood warnings. In some cases, we're issuing some severe thunderstorm warnings and tornado warnings as well on top of the flooding. In these cases, we issued flash flood emergencies in both cases, so that's another enhanced level of flooding. And then we do a lot of decision support services. So there's conference calls, there's more emails that go out. So yeah, it's pretty crazy. We'll have 5 or 6 people just in the operations area, handling the weather itself, whereas normally we only have 2 or 3. And then we might have additional management as well helping with conference calls.
For this event, the National Weather Service issued flood watches well ahead of time with several flash flood warnings during the event. And the most extreme warnings are flash flood emergencies, and several of those were also issued. The Weather Service disseminates these to the public via their website and warning system, and then they're distributed by TV meteorologists and a slew of weather sites and apps. Behind the scenes, the National Weather Service is communicating with a lot of people to help them get the message out.
Yeah, a lot of time we're updating emergency management officials who are trying to make staffing decisions of their own, trying to gauge the level of response, that they're going to have to deal with. So Harris County in particular, with millions of people there in the Houston metro area, has to be set up for high water rescues ahead of time if they think that's a possibility. They also will have to close roads, underpasses. So they look at it from a manpower standpoint. What are they in for? How many people might they need to respond to a big flood? So that's some of the decisions that are being made. And we have a chat room that's very active, also with media partners. So there's just a whole lot of traffic on what's going on. How long is it going to rain? What kind of amounts could we get? And those sometimes change as you're going through the event. So you get a lot of requests for information. And then we need information as well to know what's going on. The flash flood emergency type decisions, when you're ramping it up to that level, you have to know what's going on. Are there high water rescues ongoing? So there has to be a lot of two-way communication, to know the severity of an event. You can't just rely just on, our radar data, for example. We need to also hear from people that are out in the event.
So there's a lot of communication going on during these events, but something the weather community doesn't talk about as often is the communication from the public, rather than the communication to the public. So like Lance, I wanted to talk with some people who experienced or were nearby the flooding.
Hey, you might want to keep an eye out for an event that might be moving through that has the potential to drop a lot of rain in a very short period of time. Of course, I don't think anyone was prepared for the volume of rain that fell. And so, at least for me, I had to stay home from work a couple of days.
This is Michael. He lives west-southwest of Houston and wasn't directly impacted by the May 26th event, but did get disrupted by the Tax Day flood event that occurred early in April.
So my actual subdivision was fine. It's basically all the roads around me. I had a really difficult time getting through. So my office said, hey, don't bother, just work from home. So, that was kind of something to keep an eye on. And then, same thing kind of happened over this past weekend, I think, right before the Memorial Day weekend. Once again, I think Matt and Eric posted something saying, hey.
Quick side note here. You might hear a few people reference Matt or Eric, as Michael just did. They're referring to Matt Lanza and Eric Berger. They write for SpaceCityWeather.com. And the reason so many people I interviewed look at their site is because I asked Matt to help me find a few people to interview. Back to Michael.
kind of out of nowhere, there's this flash flooding event that's going to pop up northwest of the Houston metro area, probably about, I don't know, 60 to 90 miles northwest of Houston, in an area called, a town called Brenham. And that's where there was a lot of flooding. It impacted Brenham and all the way, I guess, east of that area, which is starting to creep into the northwest area of Houston. And the issue, even though that had no direct impact on me, the issue that we're facing now is that there's a major river that's about 5 or 6 miles or so south of where we're at. And a lot of the rain, I think there was like 20 inches of rain that dumped on that Brenham area, and that's upstream of the Brazos. So now all that water is making its way downstream. So now we're looking at a lot of road closures because the river is beginning to crest at basically historic rates. And I already have one coworker who was impacted by it and a few others.
When dramatic rainfall like this happens, there's a twofold flooding event. There's the day of flooding, and then there's the day after or days after flooding caused by tons and tons of water making its way downstream. Both flooding events are monitored and warned by the National Weather Service. You'll notice a theme with the people I interviewed today. They're all mainly impacted by the downstream flooding. Now, Michael received warnings for the flooding that occurred later due to downstream water movement, but not for the actual event on May 26th. He wasn't in the area that was actually impacted that day. He gets his weather information mainly via the internet and spacecityweather.com, and he has a pretty strong opinion about it.
Over the past few years, it's been traditionally through television stations, but the tendency has been to sensationalize the weather, since particularly in Houston with its ongoing flooding issues, there's been a tendency to hype up the weather. So over the years, where I follow the weather has been changing, and in particular, it took a turn, I feel, for the better when it started with Eric Berger, who started covering science for the Houston Chronicle, the local, newspaper of record for Houston. And just watching his coverage and reading his articles, he basically came at it from very much a no-frills type of coverage, where he would lay out the different weather phenomena that were impacting it, sort of a plus-minus of what type of weather, where it might have more impact, of course, based on whatever models he had available, and he would disclose what models. So, at least from what I've seen, he got a pretty good following of people who said, hey, I really appreciate your sort of no-frills, here's what it is, here's what it's not going to be. There might be some deviation, that type of thing. But, I'm not sure what happened behind the scenes. He ended up leaving the Chronicle, starting up his own sort of website, and that's when he brought in Matt Landa, who I started following as well, and again, very much along the same line. So honestly, for me, those two are my go-to guys for that.
More and more people are using sources outside of the TV weather person for their forecast. Generally, it's because looking at an app or a website is quick and easy, but for Michael, it was because he was tired of the hyped-up weather from the TV meteorologist. Hear, Michael. A lot of people in the weather community agree with you. We're pretty sick and tired of seeing the weather forecast hyped up, bold, and in pretty colors while using terms like polar vortex or heat dome or Godzilla El Nino or gravity destruction waves or... Okay, I made that last one up. But you get it. And good for you, Michael. You weren't happy with your weather forecast provider and made a change for the better. It's a shame these days that there's so much pressure to get clicks and good ratings. News outlets have to continually use these words to grab attention, but I digress. The next person I talked to is Reagan, who also uses Space City Weather as a weather source. He lives in the west side of Houston, but works west of there in Fortman County. His thoughts on Space City Weather versus TV meteorologist is similar to Michael's. Here's Reagan.
I think over the last week, the guys online are better than the network news guys, in my opinion.
Yeah. So have you seen any of that flooding, or have you had to change your?
Yeah, actually I have seen it. I own a trucking company, and we haul waste. So we're we have dumpsters and we haul construction trash, and we're in the plants and refineries. We haul hazardous, non-hazardous waste. So we're in the trucking business. So anytime roads are impacted, it directly affects our ability to service our customers. And in fact, we have a contract with a city in Fort Bend County that's literally underwater. It's a town called Simonton, Texas, a little town, probably 1,000 people. It's way away. It's probably 45 miles west of Houston, and it's on the banks of the Brazos River, and the whole town's flooded. It's a big problem. So I got as close as I could today. There's a lot of road closures, and it's a mess, and it is going to dramatically affect, thousands of people. So I was dealing with city managers and mayors and of towns that are flooded, trying to figure out when the river is going to go down and the water recede, and how we can get dumpsters out to them to pick up all the trash. Yeah, I think observationally, the amount of water I saw today, I'm 35 years old. I've been in Houston my entire life. I went to college 90 miles away and then came back to Houston. I've never seen, so I feel like I have a good grasp of the weather in our area. And the amount of water I saw in Fort Bend County, the amount of water coming through the Brazos River is literally mind-blowing. I was meeting with 80-year-old men in tears because their town is underwater, and they had never seen it. And so the amount of water that fell into the Brazos River, I don't know how you say it, basin or whatever, is really, really shocking. And as it comes downriver, all the way to the Gulf, it's way more than anyone thought, and it's affecting way more people who never considered their property or their house would flood by the Brazos River coming out of its banks at this level. It is gut-wrenching and mind-blowing how much water is moving down the Brazos River. And I don't even think people in Houston realize it, because again, it is 45 miles, west and in rural areas. And I would be shocked if you talk to 10 people from Houston if they even knew where Simonton was. But no one knows how bad it is flooded by the Brazos River coming out of its banks. I can tell you that.
Wow. Yeah, that's rough to hear.
Yeah, it is. But and then ironically for me, it brings me a lot of business. So it's just, you don't feel good about it, but that my team at work better get ready, because there's a lot of stuff to clean up.
So the weather is pretty important to Reagan. It impacts his business directly, and in order to run his operation smoothly, he needs to get good information. I noticed he uses Space City Weather, but where else does he get his weather forecast?
I'm really into weather. It's kind of my unofficial hobby.
Yeah.
So I have a couple weather apps. I follow forecasters and weather people on Twitter. I would say I get the majority of my information from an app.
Okay.
Which is, I use WeatherBug.
Okay, WeatherBug. Gotcha. Cool.
And then my second source is Twitter, through Eric Berger and Matt Lanza, the guy I follow, and their blog, which is, I think, Space City Weather.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And how often do you check those two sources?
Multiple times a day.
A combination of weather apps, social media, and Space City Weather does the trick for Reagan and his business, and a little later in the conversation he mentions that he sees National Weather Service watches and warnings on TV, radio, and social media. Using a variety of sources for weather forecasts can do a lot of good. Sometimes certain biases can get washed out, and overall you have more information and can plan better for what you need to do. Now, thus far, I haven't discussed Turn Around, Don't Drown with anyone. Neither Michael or Reagan mentioned driving through flooded roadways, only that road closures had impacted their route to work. This is where Nico enters. He lives on the Lower West Side of Houston.
Personally speaking, when it comes to these occurrences, definitely driving was the hardest thing to do, especially in areas where there was flooding, There was this one time where I was with my brother in his car, which is a Ford Explorer. That's an SUV. And we had to drive through about 2 feet of flood water, and thankfully his car was high enough to where it didn't go in his car. But we actually did witness a person drive their car into the water, and thankfully they weren't so deep enough to where they couldn't pull out anymore or escape from their car. And they pulled out, fortunately enough. But it was a very scary experience because me and my brother were deciding, should we get out and help this person? Do we need to, go to their rescue?
Because of these experiences and the things Nico has seen in the news, he now takes flooding much more seriously than he did before.
Up until now, this year, I never took flash flood warnings seriously, and I always found it to be a nuisance whenever it would ring on my phone. But now, whenever I see them, I genuinely do feel, not a sense of fear per se, but just I do feel worried for the surrounding community around me and how they're going to be affected by the flood and what they're going to need to do in order to get their lives back on track after being affected by it.
Nico isn't alone here. Immersion is one of the best forms of education. When you experience a weather event, it makes a lasting impact. You see what it does and how it affects people, and ultimately you have a new understanding of the phenomenon. Such is the case for the next person I talked to, Ruben. He lives between Houston and Corpus Christi and has seen firsthand the dangers of flooding.
I don't understand. Sometimes it's people's reaction to flooding, and I see it on social media about cars getting swept up in the currents and things like that, and you think that people would be more cautious, especially water running across the road and not go in because the car can get swept off its wheel within 10 inches of water, and that's the only thing that concerns me, and that comes from a law enforcement perspective because I was a law enforcement officer, and I was involved with rescues and things like that, but people still keep doing it, so hopefully people are a little bit more aware, and take heed when they see water across the road or flood warnings.
Yeah, the National Weather Service's slogan is "Turn around, don't drown."
Exactly.
Ruben said, if you see water going across a road, don't go in, which is the exactly same thing as turn around, don't drown, just not as catchy. But that doesn't matter. This type of mentality is common sense for him now, and not because of a catchy phrase, but because of his experiences. The final person I talked to is Joyce, and I chatted with Joyce for over 30 minutes, and it was an absolute pleasure. She had such a wealth of information, I ended up actually taking a few notes. Joyce lives in Port Lavaca, which my Spanish 2 knowledge from high school tells me that means cowport. And Port Lavaca is located along the Gulf Coast between Corpus Christi and Galveston. So where does Joyce get her weather information?
I usually get it from the Victoria Advocate, which proves to be probably 30 to 40% correct.
30 to 40% correct? I swear, meteorologists have the only job where they can be wrong half the time and still... Oh, you've heard that one? Yeah, me too. For non-weather listeners, this is a joke that meteorologists hear all the time, and it's a bit of a pet peeve. Back to Joyce.
Well, if weather is imminent, and if bad weather is imminent, and it shows to be something that we need to take caution about, I will turn on the television to the Weather Channel and see what they have to say. But they're usually so locked in with what the weather is up on the East Coast that they very seldom give us our local information that we're interested in.
You can probably tell by now why I enjoyed my conversation with Joyce so much. She tells it like it is and just gave a billion-dollar company a smackdown. And she brings up an important issue that she also has with her newspaper.
But then, of course, Victoria is looking for the weather. I live 22 miles from Victoria in Port Lavaca. So Victoria is looking for the weather in their immediate area. So it does not necessarily reflect what we 22 miles away are going to get. However, it's a general indication of what is going to happen. and they may have 5 inches of rain in Victoria. Of course, the official weather is taken out at the Victoria Regional Airport, so they may only have gotten 8/10 of an inch of rain out there. So even if Victoria City got 5 inches of rain, they're going to only report 8/10 of an inch, because that's what the official weather forecast, reading is out at the airport, which is kind of crazy, but that's the way it is. And we may have gotten 2 inches down here, or we may have gotten 6 inches, or we may have gotten 1.5 inches. So it never really gives us our true picture.
Joyce has a detailed understanding of weather variability, and she knows exactly where the official weather observation is for her area. Consider me impressed. Let's hear what she experienced during the past rain events.
I live out in the country on a farm, so I can look out and say, well, my pasture is flooded and my sheep are looking for high ground, which they do. They do have some high ground here. And I can see water standing in my pasture, or I can walk out in my yard and slosh through water in the lower areas. But it usually dries off in a day or two. So that's what we've been looking at. However, with the continuous rain over the past, even over the past couple of weeks, even 1/10 of an inch of rain will cause water to stand.
Wow. So the ground's pretty saturated down there, and when it rains, it just kind of piles up.
Yes, it is. The ground is very saturated.
Okay.
I don't know how deep it's saturated. I don't know how deep the moisture goes. Right down here on the coast, where I live, we have what you call black gumbo, which is a black clay soil. It's a very fertile soil for farmers. It's very good for them to plant crops in. But it's a compact soil, and that's why it holds the moisture for a while. But you may, if it's been very, very, very dry and you dig down 3 inches, you're going to find dry soil. On the flip side of the coin, if it's been raining like this and then it dries off and you don't have rain for a few days and you dig down, the top part of the soil will be dry, hard, like cement. And if you get past that, you get down about 3 or 4 inches and you find wet soil down there.
We talked about soil and farming techniques for the next 10 minutes. Her attention to detail was amazing. She knew when and why farmers planted and harvested, the issues of too much rain or too little rain, the list goes on. But when it comes down to it, she said,
let's see, I can't use that word probably if you're recording me, but it's a crapshoot. Well, yeah, because it's, whatever they do, they're gambling. They're absolutely gambling. Every farmer gambles.
It's not just the farmers. Sometimes it's a crapshoot for meteorologists too. We've all had that forecast where we think, this might happen, or that might happen. Anyways, I had one more question for Joyce.
Have you ever heard of the phrase, turn around, don't drown?
Turn around, don't drown. Oh, yes, definitely. It's been on the weather when they've, particularly in the Houston area. But yes, I had definitely heard that phrase.
Oh, okay, very cool.
They had it on the radio, the television, on the weather when they were showing the Houston area. Particularly, I was seeing that phrase. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Joyce. I really appreciate it. And
now, I understood from Aaron that you were also interested in a little history out in the West Texas area about where we've had rain. And
if Joyce wanted to talk more, I was certainly ready to listen. But I just figured after taking 20 minutes of her time, she'd want to get back to her morning routine. It was 7 a.m. after all.
So rain out there is very, very precious. In 1966, I believe it was, or it may have been 67. I can't tell you the date. You'd have to look it up. They had enough rain out there that the water came cascading down through the canyons, and wiped out about 60% of the town of Sanderson. And that's where my property is close to, the town of Sanderson. If you go out there today, you'll still see houses that were damaged back in 1960, whatever, 6 or 7, that have never been rebuilt.
Wow.
But they did go ahead and build, I don't know whether they're concrete and rock structures like dams across the some of the canyons to try to control the flow of water, because you know what a flash flood is. Well, that's what they were having out there. The rain doesn't necessarily have to be in the specific area, but when you've got canyons and mountains or hills, you get flash flooding through previously dry areas, and then once the water has receded, it's gone, and there's no evidence of water except the destruction.
A few minutes ago, I asked her about Turn Around, Don't Drown, hoping to just get a story or her thoughts about it, and she just merely recognized that it exists. Now she's telling me about a flooding event from the 1960s and how she knows all about flash flooding, partly because of these events. We talked for another 15 minutes, and it kind of felt like I was back in Media 201 all over again. No complaints. So here's a question. Do catchy phrases like turn around, don't drown make a difference in people's perception? It's an unfair question and pretty impossible to answer with any confidence, but it's important to think about. In my earlier conversation with Lance Wood, I asked him about the message they were putting out to residents during the flooding.
Really urging people for our call to action in our statements for flooding, we really just started focusing on stay home. Stay home, stay safe, just stay off the roads, because almost all of our flood deaths come from people, driving into flooded roadways and being surprised by the depth of the water.
Well, just a follow-up, do you guys commonly, communicate or tweet out or whatever the turn around, don't drown phrase?
We do, and we use that in the warnings as well, but I guess we're even trying to take that maybe even a step further and hoping that you're not even on the roads, so you can kind of look at it from the standpoint of, yes, if you are on the roads, turn around and don't drown, but we're starting to look at it from the standpoint of don't even be there in the first place if we can get there. So we kind of message both.
This had me thinking about how we don't have these types of phrases for hail, tornadoes, or wind. The main message for those types of weather is to stay inside and take cover. Phrases like turn around, don't drown, and other phrases are a tiny, tiny part of communicating a clear and articulate message. Meteorologists and social scientists are working together to make that message the best it can be. A few things I learned from today's conversations. 1. People learn a lot more about weather safety after actually experiencing it rather than just hearing about it. Nico had a newfound respect for flooding after a hairy situation with a flooded roadway. Ruben has respected the dangers of flooding after a long time for working various water rescues, and Joyce has a wealth of knowledge from her many years of living in the farmlands of Texas. This isn't necessarily a bad way to learn about weather, but it could be concerning if certain dangers aren't taken seriously until they actually do some damage. Hopefully we don't see that in the 2016 hurricane season. 2. People are using a plethora of sources for their weather information. Michael and Reagan are leaning more towards using social media in online sites like Space City Weather. Even Joyce uses several sources like the Victoria Advocate and the Weather Channel. There's a lot of competition out there, which is both bad and good. It may drive some outlets to hype it up, which we saw with Michael can drive viewers away, but having so many different sources also means viewers can venture elsewhere if they're dissatisfied with the product. And 3. Advocating to avoid flash flooding entirely might be the best way to keep the public out of harm's way. We talked with Michael earlier, and he simply avoided roadways during flooding and avoided potential issues. This is my speculation, based only on a few conversations and observations, but the avoidance message is something that the weather community does with severe weather, tropical weather, and winter weather. Why should it be different for flooding? So I'm curious, what do you think about Turn Around, Don't Drown? Has it saved your life? Have you heard about it before this podcast? Let me know what you think on Twitter at the WX Junkies or at WeatherDAC. And if Twitter isn't your thing, shoot me an email at theweatherjunkies@gmail.com. As a reminder, you can listen to this podcast on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, and any of your other favorite podcast sources. And go ahead and give us a review or rating while you're listening. I'd really appreciate it. Remember, you can catch our live shows on Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern on YouTube. A big thank you to Lance Wood over at the Houston Galveston National Weather Service for taking some time out of his busy schedule to chat with me. Thank you to Michael, Reagan, Nico, Mike, and Joyce for sharing their experience with me. And finally, thanks everyone for listening. I'll see you next time on Weather Ready or Not.